As we approach the end of the Rise of the Floodborn metagame in Disney's Lorcana, I wanted to go ahead and document for historical purposes where I think that each of the 24 legendaries we have in the game right now rank in a tier list. And this is going to be based off of meta gameplay, representation, what cards have shown to be high impact versus low impact. And yeah, it's just going to document things before we get our third set into the Inkland. So this is being made on February 4th, 2024. And if you watch this many years into the future, you'll know what the meta was like all those years ago. But let's go ahead and get started. So to start things off, we have what was considered the best legendary in the first chapter when it was only that set released, and that is Rapunzel. She was easily S tier in that format, but since then has been knocked down since she's not really utilized all that much in Steel Song, kind of at the beginning of the Rise of the Floodborn meta, but later on towards the end of the meta, she definitely has come back into play. I think she's a solid A tier though. She has a lot of application still, and she's one of those cards that is kind of like a staple, air quotes, where she will always have utility because drawing cards and healing your characters will always be relevant, and therefore no matter how many cards are released, unless she gets directly power crept, she'll always be good, and that's why she still demands a $50 price tag, and this is in terms of Canadian dollars, by the way, guys. Next up, we're going to rank Surfer Stitch. I would say Surfer Stitch was probably like B/A tier in the first chapter, but as the Rise of the Floodborn meta has come out, he's probably dropped off a little bit. I don't think he's necessarily bad because that 8 toughness stat is really relevant, but you don't really see him played all that much. But when he does play, he usually is high impact for the sake that he draws 2 cards. So you do see this card in things like the Amber Ruby Mufasa, and there are some other spicy builds that use this. He doesn't really get played in Steel Song anymore, but he can still be a meta threat, and as we move forward, he, I think, has a lot of application potentially with like healing and getting, draws off, for example, with Rapunzel, or just being a big body that you can kind of utilize in different ways. Next up, we've got Mufasa, a card that was probably considered C tier at the beginning of the Rise of the Floodborn meta, but as people began to kind of explore more, we saw the emergence of Amber Emerald and Amber Ruby Mufasa decks, and this deck once upon a time topped the Pixelborn leaderboard. I think I would categorize Mufasa personally as a B. There is definitely a case to say he's A tier, but I just think that once people kind of learned how to play against Mufasa, you can technically play around it. But Mufasa is one of those cards that as more good characters come out that can trigger off the Mufasa, it only gets better. Of course, the downside is the randomization. You don't know what you're going to top deck, but we're going to get some more cards that are going to allow us to see the top cards of our decks, and that may or may not be good with Mufasa depending on how fast and slow those engines are, but I think he's solid B tier right now. Next up, we have Snow White, and honestly, I secretly think Snow White is A tier, but because she's not really used in the meta, I'm going to also categorize her as B tier. Yes, she is slow, but after playing with her a little bit, I do think that she has a lot of potential, and she's one of those cards that you don't really know if it's going to get better in time, but she has a really powerful effect, and if there's a way to constantly protect her, she can definitely just dominate a game because you can get back insane amounts of resources that are in your discard pile and just constantly recycle them. And I do have some gameplay probably linked in the description or on my channel if not, that you can see that, how she's being utilized. She is pretty strong in my opinion. But there you can see the Amber package, A tier Rapunzel, and then B tier Stitch Surfer, Mufasa Betrayed Leader, and Snow White Well Wisher. Next up, we have what is by far the most popular ink color and the most represented, and I think by this point the undisputed most powerful ink color in the game right now, and that is Amethyst. We all know, well, hopefully we all know, how powerful Ruby Amethyst was. It was by far the best deck in Rise of the Floodborn, and it was definitely a huge contender along with Amber Steel's Song in the first chapter. But despite that, its legendaries, I don't know, may not be pulling as much weight as you think. So starting off, we're going to start with the Elsa. This was the card that everybody wanted in the first chapter, and I think Elsa has solidified herself in the Rise of the Floodborn meta as a solid B tier. Might be a hot take because she is still very, very powerful. The fact that this is used in the Amethyst Steel version, she can just lock down a board and just help you progress through for game, is very powerful. She's not really utilized all that much in the tier 0 air quotes version of Ruby Amethyst, but she's still a very good card. And I think no matter how the meta progresses in the next maybe 2 or 3 sets, she will still be relevant just for her ability to slow tempo. That is proving to be a big factor in Lorcana. Next up, we have Ursula. And I personally think Ursula is also B tier. There is a case to be made that she could be considered A tier right now in the Rise of the Floodborn meta because she is used in the Ruby Amethyst control deck and maybe even the Steel Amethyst control deck because her big body being a 2/8 makes it very hard for other decks to deal with. You need like direct removal, so things like Hades Infernal Schemer, Let It Go to put her into the Inkwell, or just Ruby cards like Maleficent Dragon, Be Prepared to just wipe her off the board. It's very hard for Steel to deal with, and because of that, she is just a big body that quests for 3. Not only that, she makes your opponent lose a lore, which can come up and be deciding factors in games, and also she replaces herself on play with drawing a card. So for all of those reasons, she is definitely a really good card, but her impact, I think, overall is just a little less than you would want it to be. The fact that she's also uninkable, and she doesn't do anything to progress the board state right away like an Elsa does. Like she does a different kind of thing in replacing herself, making your opponent lose the lore. She slows, not necessarily tempo, but she slows the game down with the lore loss to a certain extent. But she is very vulnerable, right? Like you can Lady Tremaine her, you can, like I said, Maleficent Dragon, Be Prepared, Hades, Let It Go, etc. And some Steel decks can still deal with her. You know, Strength of the Raging Fire, Cinderella, smash into it, for example. But she is still high impact, and I think overall she is B tier. She is, again, well represented in the Ruby Amethyst decks. Next up, you have Fairy Godmother, and this is going to be our first C tier. I don't think she's necessarily D tier, but I think that she can have some use, similar to Snow White. She's not an on-play effect. You have to quest with her to get her effect of giving your other characters Challenger +3 and basically the Dr. Facilier effect where they come back to your hand when they're banished in a challenge. But for that reason, she's very slow and her effect isn't all that great. First of all, you need other characters on board in order to utilize her that well. She needs to quest, so she needs to survive a whole turn. She does cost 5, so she's questing probably on turn 6. And then not only that, you need to have your opponent's characters exerted so that you can actually use the Challenger ability. So a lot of conditions need to be met to make her good, and because of that right now, she's just very underwhelming. When her effect does go off though, she can generate you enough advantage to essentially clinch a game off, but I just think that she's just way too slow, way too conditional, and for that reason she is C tier. Next up, we have Madame Mim, Purple Dragon. I'm also going to throw this into C tier, not necessarily for the same reasons as Fairy Godmother, but she does require a lot to set up, and then once she hits the board, while she is a 4-questing evasive 5/7, which is very hard to out against some decks, she's just too much of a liability in other matchups. So for example, she's very good against Steel because it's hard for Steel to do 7 direct damage to something with an evasive because they can't challenge it because Steel usually doesn't play evasives. Any Steel combination that is, right, like Amber Steel or Sapphire Steel, etc. But the fact that the Madame Mim has to bounce 2 cards back to hand actually is a good thing sometimes, like bouncing back Merlin Rabbit or Goat or any other utility card that has good on-play effects can net you additional resources back to your hand after you've used them, and for that reason that's great. That's why Madame Mim Fox and Madame Mim Snake are so good as well, and they're overstated. This card, not necessarily overstated at 5/7. The 5 strength is relevant, the 7 toughness is definitely relevant, and the fact that she's evasive and quests for 4 is definitely amazing. With all that being said though, once she hits the board, she has no other kinds of protection. So if your opponent just has any other kind of removal, you know, you've just spent all that time setting her up and then she just gets outed for free basically. So, and then, you know, you have no board presence because you bounce 2 cards back to hand, and while it's nice to regain that advantage, now you're behind because your opponent has an established board and you don't. So for that reason, she's still C tier. I do think that she has really good potential to become a lot better, and it's really unfortunate that nobody really explored too much with her, or, you know, maybe people did and she just really just wasn't good, but overall I do like this card, but I just think that it's just too much of a commitment to set up to be so easily outed, and for that reason she lands in the C tier. Next up, we have what is probably the most underrepresented color in Lorcana, and that is Emerald. Now I would say that in the first chapter this color didn't really have that much of an identity. It was considered more of an aggro color, but it was on the weaker side, I would say. It did have some tournament representation, but as we saw Rise of the Floodborn come out, we really saw the identity of Emerald kind of take place with the discard engine, utilizing mainly Emerald Steel as that color combination. But as a result, the legendaries ended up not really being too relevant. And so to start off, the Beast Wolfsbane is our first D tier card, just because it's a 5 cost uninkable, makes it too much of a liability in and of itself, and the effect of exerting all of your opponent's damage cards never really was that relevant. The fact that it has Rush and is a 4/4 body is good. If this card was inkable, I think it would see play. That being said, this card might end up having some utility in the future, but again, that uninkability is a real detriment and liability for any deck that plays this card. It is unfortunate because it is a cool card, but again, just not relevant at all or represented in the meta. Next up, we've got John Silver, and I think John Silver deserves a C tier spot, despite also not really being played at all in the meta. It did see some play in Chapter 1, but basically because the meta evolved with Emerald to say if you're going to play Emerald, it's likely Emerald Steel discard or even Emerald Amber. This card didn't support that line because the best version of discard ended up being the Bucky, which focused on Floodborns. Despite that, though, John Silver being inkable is a huge plus. At a 6 cost, 5/5 body, it is a decent stat line with a really good effect of giving your opponent's cards Reckless, and whenever it quests for 2, it also gives any opponent card that you can choose Reckless as well. So, for example, you can't choose warded characters on your opponent's end, but anything else that without ward or something you can choose. And this is helpful because Emerald is known as a tempo disrupting color. Unfortunately, it never really took off like that because all of its good cards are uninkable, right? Bippity Boppity Boo, Mother Knows Best, Lucifer, Bounce, what else? I think, well, yeah, you get the pick. I mean, Beast Wolfsbane, even though it's not a great card, but if it was inkable, it might have been relevant. As we move into the Inklands, I think Emerald will become more splashable as other colors develop stronger and stronger packages, just because Emerald does have a lot of like singular power cards like Morph, Bippity Boppity Boo, etc., that you can just splash those in and it instantly makes any other color that much stronger. But yeah, John Silver, I like the card and I do think it's C tier. I think it is playable, but it definitely isn't meta because, again, Emerald just isn't meta in and of itself. Next up, we've got Beast Relentless, and I'm going to also throw this into C tier. There are definitely some amazing combos and great stuff that you can do with this card in order to close games out. Unfortunately, just because of how oppressive the meta is with Amber Steel Song, Sapphire Steel, and Ruby Amethyst, it's very hard to set up your board state in a way that you can really utilize this in a meta competitive setting. And as a result, this deck never really took off, even though it's a really cool deck. And I think potentially it could become better, but being a 6 inkable is nice, but a 4/5 stat line I think is decent, you know, and if you can get the effect off, you can definitely close out a game very easily with it. In certain control decks, if Emerald does end up going that way, it might become relevant because, you know, once your opponent is on no cards in hand, for example, on the discard deck, I can see teching in 2 copies of Beast Relentless to close out a game, very relevant. But yeah, as of right now, not really represented in the meta. And then finally, we have Bell Hidden Archer, the card that everybody was hyped for because it was, I think, the first legendary revealed as we were awaiting the Rise of the Floodborn meta, and everybody thought this card was going to be super broken, myself included, and then it just ended up not being relevant whatsoever because as we saw the meta develop and the rest of the cards come out for Rise of the Floodborn, this card just ended up being way too slow, not really that relevant, and people would just be able to play around it and or straight up out it without challenging in order to play around its effect, and therefore it is not represented at all in meta scenes, I don't think. Not that I've seen, at least, and I've seen quite a few big tournaments both online and in person, and this card was just never in top 8, never in top 16. So unfortunately, Bell Hidden Archer also in the D tier. Again, Emerald just suffering from the fact that it wasn't really a meta relevant color. Next up, we have the very powerful Ruby ink color, and while I wouldn't say this color is top tier or even the second best, just because of how well this paired with Amethyst, both in the first chapter and in Rise of the Floodborn, this color definitely can make a case for being the second best color in the game, even though individually I don't think it is. We're going to start off with the Mickey Mouse. I think Mickey Mouse is once again a solid C tier. This card saw play in the first chapter meta and was relevant. A 4 questing evasive that costs 8 but is a 5/5 body was very hard to out given the limited number of interactions we had with just the first chapter. But as we saw the Rise of the Floodborn meta come around, this card completely kind of fell off. It's not necessarily a bad card similar to John Silver, it's just that they're just better cards to play. The fact that it is inkable is relevant, but similar to how Madam Mim is also just a big body with evasive, it's just too easy to out, and over time I think these cards will just get worse as, well, this card will, not Madam Mim, because as you get better cards to bounce, the bouncing ability might actually become relevant. But with Mickey Mouse, he's kind of just, you play him, you hope he survives, and then he quests for 4. And again, in a simplified meta state, this card was absolutely insane because it was very hard to out given the limited number of removal. But as we know, more and more removal is going to come out as more sets come out, and this card just gets worse as you can't protect it as easily. For example, the new song for Steel, and then Along Came Zeus coming out into the Inkland deals 5 damage to character or location for ink, right? And so you can imagine paying 8 ink to cast this and then just getting 5 damage dealt to it right away on a 4 costing song. You're just like, great, that goes my tempo, there goes, that's a game-winning play, right, for your opponent, not for you. But I do think it's still relevant because you can combo it with like the Mufasa deck. Getting this off of a Mufasa is absolutely crazy because the next turn you're likely just going to quest with it for game. This comes in exerted, your opponent likely can't out it because of its evasive ability. So I think it still has some application right now as we're in still a little bit of a simplified meta state. But again, it's not really played in meta decks. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the worst right now, but eventually I think it will move down to D tier as we get more ways of removing characters. Next up, we have Donald Duck, and unfortunately, I'm going to put him in D tier for right now. A cool card and a cool concept. I think this will have potential to move up in the tiers over time. Actually, I think it definitely will, and I think it might end up landing into B tier depending on how we see different color combinations used, like maybe Ruby Steel will become a thing, and Steel's ability to damage might become relevant to damage your own cards, and then this card can quest for like 4 or something crazy like that, or 5, right? Because if it has 4 damage, it gains an extra 4 lore, then it quests for 5. Yeah, so it could become relevant, but again, the fact that this card has to hit the field, survive for a turn, and then quest with damage makes it a little hard to set up. It definitely isn't represented at all in the meta right now, and because of that, it lands in D tier. Next up, I kind of skipped the other first chapter card. We have Maleficent Dragon, and this is, in my opinion, going to be our first S tier card. One of the best legendaries in set 1, along with Rapunzel, and then really solidified itself as a huge meta contending threat in Rise of the Floodborn. And I know some people are probably going to comment, for those of you that are around during this time of the video being made, that the top tier deck, Ruby Amethyst, that ended up winning the biggest online Pixelborn tournament, cut Maleficent Dragons altogether. But out of the 7 of the 8 decks that were Ruby Amethyst in that top 8, so yeah, 7 decks, Ruby Amethyst, only one of them was playing no Maleficent Dragons. Yes, it ended up winning, but the other 6 decks in that top 8 played Maleficent Dragon, if I recall. The card is definitely still relevant in the other tournaments that followed that big one. Maleficent Dragon was being played in deck lists. It's usually played up to 3 copies, sometimes 2, but it is a force to be reckoned with. The reason is because while it does cost a lot, it is inkable, so you see it early on. It's not a detriment. You just put it into your inkwell, and then just being able to cast this late game, instantly banishing a character when it hits the field, means that it instantly goes 1 for 1. Being a 7/5 body means that if it survives, yes, it can quest for 2, but it likely can just out anything else on the board. Being at 7 strength, usually nothing is going to survive that. Very, very few cards will. So it is a powerhouse of a card. It is so relevant in just shutting big threats down. And yeah, it's just one of the best legendaries in the game by far as of the Rise of the Floodborn meta. Next up, we have Scar, and I'm going to toss Scar into C tier. This card, was decently hyped up. The problem is it's uninkable. The 7 cost for 6/5 body is nice, but, why wouldn't you just play Maui, which, funnily enough, is just a rare and is infinitely better, in my opinion, than this. While the effect of readying itself anytime it banishes a character is nice, usually you're only challenging 2, maybe 3 things, which is nice in terms of card advantage, before this card just ends up taking too much damage and gets banished itself. And again, for the liability of being uninkable, you'd rather just play Maui, which has a 6/5 body on it in and of itself, with the rush ability as well. Yes, this card can quest for 2, but you're not playing this to quest with, right? It's nice to have that versatility, but I just don't think this card is too relevant. It might be better in the Ruby Sapphire Popsicle deck that was hyped up at the beginning of the Rise of the Floodborn format, simply for the fact that you can ink this with Fishbone Quill or Winnie the Pooh if you do end up getting this early and it's not relevant. But overall, I just don't think that this card ended up seeing too much meta play. In the Ruby Amethyst control decks, sometimes you would see like 1 copy of this, but even then, I don't know why you wouldn't just play Maui's and things like that and Madame Mim Fox, right? Just better cards with Rush that give you better utility and are inkable. So yeah, I think Scar is a solid C tier. Moving on to Sapphire now, I think you really saw this color really establish itself in the metagame towards the end of the Rise of the Floodborn format. Obviously, early on, we had Ruby Sapphire, but that kind of fell off very quickly once it was kind of discovered that Ruby Amethyst was once again going to be top tier, and it absolutely devastated the Sapphire Ruby deck. However, the Sapphire Steel deck made Belle, in my opinion, an A tier card because it was one of the very effective closers that this deck would use in order to win the game, and in my opinion, the Sapphire Steel deck and Bell in and of itself is a very high skill cap card. In order to use this correctly, you don't just want to kind of just drop Bell and just say, well, I hope I can quest for 5. You really want to play it strategically and understand your opponent's lines of play so that you know, like, have I played around the Be Prepared? Have I played around the Maleficent Dragon removal? Am I at risk of getting Lady Tremaine or, getting Tinkerbell smashed or, whatever? And with that, you can put this on board and comfortably quest for 5, because once you establish your 10 ink, the only way for your opponent to deal with Bell is just deal with the character itself, right? There's no way to interact with ink right now. And so this card was definitely a very effective closer for the Sapphire Steel deck, which in my opinion is definitely up there in one of the best decks of the format, contending with Ruby Amethyst for one of the better decks. But like I said, it's a high skill cap deck, and it has to be piloted by somebody who really knows the meta and knows the deck inside and out in order to play effectively. Next up, we've got Hades, and you could make a case for Hades to be S tier, but the fact that it is uninkable and the fact that it's just strictly worse than Maleficent in terms of it puts it into the opponent's inkwell, giving them a resource instead of outright banishing the card. But to be fair, sometimes putting something into the inkwell is beneficial, like putting a Mufasa into the inkwell plays around its ability of being banished to trigger its effect. That being said, though, it's still just strictly worse, in my opinion, than Maleficent Dragon. In isolation, or in the decks that it's used in, I think it is S tier. So in like the Sapphire Steel deck, it would be considered S tier in my opinion. But in relevance to all the other, or in comparison to all the other legendaries, I do think it's A tier. The ability is still super relevant, though. It's one of the only hard removal characters that we have in the game right now. And the fact that you can play this in a color combination where you have Steel to deal with the early and mid range of the game, or midpoint of the game, and then you have things like Hades and Let It Go's in order to close out big threats. Like, Steel usually can't deal with an Ursula, or it's very hard for them to deal with it, but Hades just straight up outright puts it into the inkwell, not banishes. So the synergy works very well, and Hades, I think, has really established itself as a meta relevant card because Sapphire is a meta relevant color. Next up, we've got Alice, and I would personally put this in C tier. Not really played, and kind of just underwhelming in general right now. Giving support to all the other characters is definitely nice, but we haven't really seen that be a relevant force. Moving into the Inklands, though, being able to beef up early game characters in order for them to take out locations might become more relevant. So for that reason, Alice might become better. But right now in the Rise of the Floodborn meta, she's absolutely not played in any meta relevant decks. Does not mean she's bad. At a 3 costing 1/4 character that gives support to all your other characters, it definitely can be relevant, and she's inkable, so she's not the worst, and that kind of puts her into the C category. Next up, you have Sisu, and I think Sisu is an interesting card. Unfortunately, it is uninkable, but most of the time if you're playing this card, you want to play it out. You don't want to ink it because its ability to generate you card advantage is really strong. That being said, though, it's very hard to kind of protect this card, and that's kind of the issue. Being a 2/4 body is nice because that 4 toughness does survive a lot. Like, it survives Smash, Teeth and Ambitions, etc. Unfortunately, the 4 stat line still gets absolutely obliterated by Madam Mim Fox, and that's kind of why Sisu is not really used in any of the Sapphire decks, because it's not going to be used in Sapphire Steel, and that's kind of the only relevant, meta-relevant Sapphire deck out there right now. And even in the Sapphire Ruby deck, it wouldn't be used anyways, because again, you have no way to really protect this once it quests, and it's very easy to out once it's exerted. So it gets you kind of 2 lore, one card advantage, and then nothing else from there, right? If it had a better stat line, or Madam Mim Fox didn't exist, and maybe this card would see play, but again, it's just too much of a risk being an uninkable resource that kind of has to sit there for a turn before it gets its effect off, and then if it does get the effect off, you lose tempo afterwards. But it does replace itself after it quests, but it has to quest, and you can see why. Like, it's strictly worse than Ursula, because Ursula replaces itself with a card draw on play, whereas Sisu has to wait to quest, so it's vulnerable for a turn, and then when it does quest at a 4 toughness body with Ursula at 8, like, yeah, Ursula costs more, but you can see like why Ursula was much more resilient, because it doesn't die directly to like a Maui or a Fox or something, right? So for that reason, I think Sisu is C tier. Still a decent card, not necessarily the worst, and it can be played in some variations, but not really too meta relevant. To close things off, we have the Steel Ink, and in my opinion, this is the second best ink color in the game, just behind Amethyst, and for good reason. In tournament topping results and in the meta, you see Steel being paired with almost every other ink in the game except for Ruby to be a meta relevant force. You have Amber Steel Song, you have Sapphire Steel Ramp, you have Amethyst Steel Control, and you have Emerald Steel Discard, all of which are very meta relevant and powerful decks in and of themselves. And that being said, unfortunately, the first two legendaries, both in Chapter 1 and after the release of Rise of the Floodborn, were absolute D tier. The Gantu and Teika have no place in the meta for the competitive scene. They're just way too expensive for what they do, and their effects aren't even that good, even if they were cheaper. So, unfortunately, Gantu making, characters less than 2 on your opponent's side of the field can't challenge. Not relevant whatsoever, and it costs 8, so who's really playing 2 costing cards that late into the game? And then Teika's ability to banish and gain lore is not relevant either, since again you have to wait to trigger the effect for a turn, and you have to banish something that the opponent has that it can deal with. Like, it's just too conditional, too slow, not good. There are way better cards to play, and as a result, these cards are, yeah, unfortunately in the D tier. Now, with the Rise of the Floodborn, we saw 2 new Steel Legendaries be released, obviously, and absolutely, without a doubt, Beast Tragic Hero, I think, takes the top spot for the best Legendary in the game right now. This will change over time as more cards are released that deal direct damage, especially among other ink colors, and or just more removal comes into play. Because the Beast is so powerful right now given the limited card pool, as soon as this thing drops, usually on turn 5 or turn 4 if it's played in the Sapphire Steel ramp deck, and you can ramp through with Fishbone Quill to play it on turn 4, you are instantly putting a lot of pressure on your opponent, because this card says, I demand an answer. I demand you to have damage on me or just outright remove me. Otherwise, I'm going to be generating who knows how much advantage, right, with the draw. In the Emerald Steel discard, this card is a Floodborn, so it triggers the Bucky. In Amber Steel Song, this card just is extra card draw for the songs and or getting you to your flutes faster. In Amethyst Steel Control, again, this card is just giving you more and more resources to continue to control the board and just keep your hand nice and fresh. So, card draw and card games is just so powerful, and this one card engine does all that and more, as long as it has no damage. But if it does have damage, it becomes a 7/5 body, just like Maleficent, so it can just run over anything most likely. Hence why it's so strong. But again, over time, this card is bound to get worse. Right now, though, it is definitely the best legendary in the game. And as of February 4th, the day I'm making this list, the prices in the market definitely reflect that. Finally, to close things off, we have Namari, and I'm going to go ahead and put Namari in the D tier. I know you can probably make a case to make her C tier, but she's just not played at all. She's kind of played as an experiment and or meme deck. Again, just like Teika and Gantu, there's just better cards to play for her right now. Her air quotes pick a fight ability that allows you to challenge ready characters is nice, but the bodyguard is actually a detriment because it means your opponent has to crash into her. You can't actually protect her with other bodyguards, which would have been nice, because you pair this with, let's say, Amber Steel, and then you have something like the Queen commanding presence to pump her up to a 6/4, or like a Maximus, which can pump her up to a 6/4 as well with the support ability, and then Maximus can protect her with bodyguard. But because she has bodyguard as well, once she's exerted from challenging a ready character, your opponent can just out her the next turn if they want. So for those reasons, she's just not played. She might get better over time, but again, it's really hard to see that being the case. If she had Rush on top of that, then there might be a case to be made that she's relevant, because she can deal with things like Prince John and whatnot that usually don't end up questing and just sit there on board for their advantage. But yeah, as of right now, this is kind of where I see the tier list landing. So we've got 2 S tier cards in Beast Tragic Hero and Maleficent Dragon. We have 3 A tier in Rapunzel, Gifted with Healing, Belle, Strange but Special, and Hades, Infernal Schemer. We've got 5 B tier cards: Stitch, Surfer, Mufasa, Betrayed Leader, Snow White, Well Wisher, Elsa, Spirit of Winter, and Ursula, Power Hungry. In the C tier, I'm not going to name all the subtitles of this one, but we've got Fairy Godmother, Madam Mim, John Silver, Beast, Mickey Mouse, Scar, Alice, and Sisu. And then to close it off in the D tier, the worst legendaries in the game, we've got Beast, Belle, Donald Duck, Gantu, Teika, and Namari. If you enjoyed this video and you made it this far, a like would be appreciated. Make sure you check out my other videos for gameplay and sometimes tournament reports and whatnot. But yeah, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Thank you again for watching. If you made it this far, Quantum is out.